Welcome to our audio lesson on the skull. The skull, or cranium, is a truly fascinating and intricate part of our skeletal system. It's not just a single bone, but a collection of bones that work together to perform some very important jobs, primarily supporting the structures of the face and, crucially, protecting our brain. In this lesson, we'll explore the main divisions of the skull, the brain case, and the facial bones, the individual bones that make up these sections. Key features and landmarks on these bones, like openings and processes, how these bones connect, including the suture lines, specialized regions like the orbits, nasal cavity, and the cranial foci where the brain sits. We'll also touch upon the paranasal sinuses and the unique hyoid bone. Don't worry if some of these terms sound new or complex. We'll explain them step by step. Our goal is to give you a solid understanding of the skull's anatomy. So let's begin our journey into the architecture of the head. Part 1. Overview of the skull. The skull, technically called the cranium, is the skeletal structure of your head. Think of it as the bony framework that gives your head its shape. Its two main functions are to support all the delicate structures of your face and, most importantly, to form a protective casing around your brain. The cranium is generally subdivided into two main parts. 1. The brain case, also known as the cranial vault. This is the rounded part of your skull that directly surrounds and protects the brain. It also houses the structures of your middle and inner ears. 2. The facial bones. These bones form the underlying structure of your face. They create the nasal cavity, where your nose is, enclose your eyeballs in sockets, called orbits, support your teeth in the upper and lower jaws, and provide attachment points for facial muscles. Now, how many bones are we talking about? In an adult, the skull is composed of 22 individual bones. Here's a fascinating detail. 21 of these bones are immobile. That means they are fixed in place and are united to form a single solid unit. This provides incredible strength. The 22nd bone is the mandible, which is your lower jaw. The mandible is the only movable bone in the skull. Think about it. When you talk, chew, or yawn, it's your mandible that's moving. So, to recap this first part, the skull, or cranium, is made of the brain case, protecting the brain, and facial bones, supporting facial structures. It consists of 22 bones, with the mandible being the only one that moves. Part 2. Anterior view of the skull, looking at the face. All right, let's imagine we're looking at a skull from the front. This is called the anterior view. What do we see? This view is dominated by the facial bones, the openings for the eyes, and the nasal cavity. We also see the upper and lower jaws, usually with teeth. The orbit. First, you'll notice the eye sockets. Each bony socket that houses an eyeball, along with the muscles that move it, is called an orbit. The upper edge of this orbit is called the supraorbital margin. Near the middle of this upper edge, there's often a small opening called the supraorbital foramen. Foramen is just a term for an opening or hole in a bone. This particular foramen allows a sensory nerve to pass through to the skin of your forehead. So, if you touch your forehead, the sensation is carried by a nerve that might pass through this opening. Below the orbit, there's another opening called the infraorbital foramen. Infra means below. This is where a sensory nerve emerges to supply the skin and structures of your face below the eye, like your upper lip and cheek. The nasal cavity and nasal septum. Looking at the nasal area, you'd see the opening into the nasal cavity. Inside, this cavity is divided into right and left halves by the nasal septum. Think of it as a wall down the middle of your nose. The upper part of this bony septum is formed by a part of the ethmoid bone called the perpendicular plate. We'll talk more about the ethmoid bone later. The lower part of the nasal septum is formed by a separate bone called the vomer bone. Nasal conchae. If you could peek inside the nasal cavity from the front, you'd see some curved bony plates projecting from the lateral walls. These are called nasal conchae, pronounced K-on-ki. Singular is concha. The largest and lowest one is the inferior nasal concha, and it's actually an independent bone of the skull. Just above it is the middle nasal concha, which is part of the ethmoid bone. There's also a superior nasal concha, even higher up and further back, also part of the ethmoid bone. It's smaller and not easily seen from a direct anterior view. What do these conchi do? They help to swirl the air you breathe in, warming and humidifying it before it goes to your lungs, and they help trap dust and particles. So, from the anterior view, key features include the orbits with their supraorbital and infraorbital foramina, and the nasal cavity, divided by the nasal septum, made of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer bone, and featuring the nasal conchi. Part 3. Lateral view of the skull. Looking from the side. Now, let's turn the skull and look at it from the side. The lateral view. This view is often dominated by the large rounded brain case sitting above and the upper and lower jaws with their teeth below. Zygomatic arch, cheekbone. A key feature you'll see on the side is a bridge of bone called the zygomatic arch. This is what we commonly call the cheekbone. It spans from the area of your cheek, just below the eye, back towards your ear. The zygomatic arch isn't just one piece. It's formed by the junction of two bony processes. A process is a projection or outgrowth of bone. The front part is a short piece called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone is the main cheekbone. 2. The back part is a longer piece called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The temporal bone is a bone on the side of your head, around your ear area. So these two processes meet in the middle, like two ends of a drawbridge, to form the complete arch. This arch is important because it's an attachment site for some major chewing muscles. Temporal fossa and infratemporal fossa. On the side of the brain case, just above the zygomatic arch, there's a shallow space called the temporal fossa. Fossa means a trench or ditch, so it's a depression. Below the level of the zygomatic arch and deep to the vertical part of your lower jaw, the mandible, is another space called the infratemporal fossa. Infra means below, so it's below the temporal fossa. Both of these fossae, the temporal and infratemporal, contain muscles that help you chew by moving your mandible. To recap the lateral view, we see the brain case, jaws, and importantly, the zygomatic arch, formed by parts of the zygomatic and temporal bones. We also have the temporal fossa above the arch and the infratemporal fossa below and deep to it, both housing chewing muscles. Part 4. Bones of the brain case, cranial vault. Let's delve deeper into the brain case, the part of the skull that encloses and protects your brain. The internal space that the brain occupies is called the cranial cavity. Calvaria and base. The rounded top of the skull is called the calvaria or skull cap. The bones forming the top and sides of the brain case are often referred to as flat bones. The floor of the brain case is called the base of the skull. This base is very complex. It has many openings for cranial nerves, blood vessels, and the spinal cord to pass through. Cranial fossae. Inside the skull, looking down at the base, it's not flat. It's divided into 3 large step-like depressions called cranial fossae. Singular, fossa. Imagine 3 terraces. The anterior cranial fossa is the highest and most forward one. 2. The middle cranial fossa is in the middle and it's deeper. 3. The posterior cranial fossa is the lowest and most backward one, and it's the deepest. These fossae are shaped to accommodate the different parts of the brain. For example, the frontal lobes of the brain sit in the anterior cranial fossa. We'll come back to these fossae in more detail later. The 8 brain case bones. The brain case is formed by 8 bones. Some are paired, meaning there's one on the right and one on the left, and some are unpaired, a single bone. The paired bones are parietal bones, 2, temporal bones, 2. The unpaired bones are frontal bone, 1, occipital bone, 1, sphenoid bone, 1, ethmoid bone, 1. Let's look at these individually. Parietal bones. These 2 bones form most of the upper lateral sides and the roof of the skull. They join together at the very top of your skull. Each parietal bone connects to the frontal bone in front, the temporal bone below it, and the occipital bone behind it. Temporal bones. These 2 bones form the lower lateral sides of the skull. Think of the area around your temples and ears. Fun fact, temporal relates to time, and this area is where hair often first turns gray. Each temporal bone is quite complex and has several regions. Squamous portion, the flat upper part. Zygomatic process. Remember this? It's the projection that extends forward to meet the zygomatic bone and form the posterior part of the zygomatic arch. Mastoid portion, located at the back. It has a large bump called the mastoid process just behind your earlobe. You can feel it. It's an attachment site for neck muscles. Petrous portion, or petrous ridge. This is a very dense, pyramid-shaped ridge of bone found on the inside of the skull, forming part of the floor of the cranial cavity. Petrous means rock-like, indicating its hardness. Inside this petrous ridge are the delicate structures of your middle and inner ears. Important landmarks on or associated with the temporal bone include external acoustic meatus. This is your ear canal, the large opening on the lateral side of the skull, leading towards your eardrum. Internal acoustic meatus, an opening on the medial, the inner side of it, for the petrous ridge inside the cranial cavity. Nerves for hearing, balance, and facial muscles pass through here. Mandibular fossa, a depression on the external base of the skull, just in front of the ear canal. This is where your mandible, lower jaw, articulates or forms a joint with the skull. This joint is the temporomandibular joint, TMJ. Articular tubercle, a smooth ridge just in front of the mandibular fossa, also part of the TMJ. Styloid process, a long, slender, pointed projection extending downwards from the base of the temporal bone. Stylus means a pen or writing tool, which it resembles. It's an attachment site for small muscles and ligaments related to the tongue and hyoid bone, a bone in your neck. Stylomastoid foramen, a small opening between the styloid process and the mastoid process. A cranial nerve that controls your facial muscles exits the skull here. Carotid canal, a zigzag tunnel that allows the major carotid artery, which supplies blood to the brain, to pass through the base of the skull. Frontal bone. This single bone forms your forehead. At the midline between your eyebrows, there might be a slight depression called the glabella. It forms the supraorbital margin, the upper rim of your eye socket, and contains the supraorbital foramen, that opening for the forehead nerve. Just above each supraorbital margin, the frontal bone is thickened, forming brow ridges, which are usually more prominent in males. Inside the cranial cavity, the frontal bone extends backward to form the roof of the orbits, eye sockets, and the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Occipital bone. This single bone forms the posterior part of the skull and the posterior base of the cranial cavity. On its outer surface, at the back midline, is a small bump called the external occipital protuberance. You can often feel this at the back of your head. It's an attachment site for a neck ligament. Lateral to this bump are the superior nuchal lines, ridges where neck muscles attach. Nuchal refers to the nape or back of the neck. The most significant feature on the base of the occipital bone is the foramen magnum. Magnum means great, so this is a very large opening. This is where the spinal cord exits the skull to connect with the brain. On either side of the foramen magnum are two oval-shaped bumps called occipital condyles. Condyle is a rounded prominence at the end of a bone, usually for articulation. These condyles articulate, form a joint, with the first vertebra of your spine, the atlas. This joint allows you to nod your head yes. Sphenoid bone. This single, incredibly complex bone is located in the central part of the skull. It's often called the keystone bone because it articulates, connects with almost every other bone in the skull. It forms a good part of the base of the central skull and extends laterally to contribute to the sides of the skull. Imagine a butterfly or a bat with outstretched wings. That's somewhat the shape of the sphenoid. Key features of the sphenoid: lesser wings, two smaller wing-like projections that form a ridge marking the boundary between the anterior and middle cranial fossae inside the skull. Greater wings, two larger wing-like projections that extend laterally and form part of the floor of the middle cranial fossa and part of the lateral wall of the skull. Sella turcica. Located at the midline in the middle cranial fossa, this structure is named for its resemblance to a Turkish saddle. Within the sella turcica is a depression called the hypophyseal fossa, or pituitary fossa, which houses the pea-sized pituitary gland, a master endocrine gland. Pterygoid plates, medial and lateral. On the inferior bottom aspect of the skull, the sphenoid has two pairs of thin, vertically oriented bony plates. the medial pterygoid plates and the lateral pterygoid plates. Pterygoid means wing-shaped. The medial ones form part of the posterior lateral walls of the nasal cavity. The lateral ones are attachment sites for chewing muscles. The sphenoid bone has several important openings, foramina and fissures, for nerves and blood vessels, optic canal, for the optic nerve from the eye to the brain, superior orbital fissure, an irregular opening into the back of the orbit for nerves and blood vessels to the eye. Foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. These are 3 openings, from anterior to posterior, found in the floor of the middle cranial fossa, allowing passage for major nerves and blood vessels. You can remember their order from front to back with the mnemonic RUS: rotundum, ovale, spinosum. Ethmoid bone. This is another single midline bone, quite delicate and complex. It's located mostly hidden within the skull, forming the roof and lateral walls of the upper nasal cavity, the upper portion of the nasal septum, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, part of the medial, inner wall of the orbit, a portion of the floor of the anterior cranial cavity. Key features of the ethmoid: crista galli, a small upward bony projection at the midline in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Crista galli means rooster's comb. It serves as an attachment point for one of the protective coverings of the brain. Cribriform plates. Located on either side of the crista galli, these are small, flattened areas with numerous tiny openings, olfactory foramina. Cribriform means sieve-like. Small nerve branches from the olfactory smell receptors in your nasal cavity pass through these openings to reach the brain. Superior and middle nasal conchae. Remember these from the nasal cavity? They are part of the ethmoid bone, projecting into the nasal cavity from its lateral walls. Ethmoid air cells. The lateral portions of the ethmoid bone contain several small air-filled spaces. These are part of the paranasal sinuses. So the 8 bones of the brain case are the paired parietal and temporal bones, and the unpaired frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bones. Each has unique features and contributes to the overall structure and protection offered by the skull. That was a dense section, so take a moment to let it sink in. Part 5. Sutures of the skull. We've mentioned that most skull bones are immobile. How are they held together so tightly? They are joined by sutures. A suture is an immobile joint between adjacent bones of the skull. Think of them like the seams in clothing, but much more intricate. The narrow gap between the bones in a suture is filled with dense, fibrous connective tissue. The sutures between the brain case bones are not straight lines. Instead, they follow irregular, tightly twisting paths. These interlocking lines add incredible strength to the skull, helping it protect the brain. Let's name the major sutures. Coronal suture. This suture runs from side to side across the top of the skull in the coronal plane, like a queen's crown or corona. It joins the frontal bone to the right and left parietal bones. Sagittal suture. This suture extends backward from the coronal suture, running along the midline at the very top of the skull, in the sagittal plane, dividing the skull into left and right halves. It unites the right and left parietal bones. Lambdoid suture. Located on the posterior skull. The sagittal suture terminates by joining this suture. The lambdoid suture extends downward and laterally on either side. It joins the occipital bone to the parietal bones and temporal bones. It's named for its upside-down V shape, which resembles the Greek letter lambda, L. Squamous suture. Located on the lateral side of the skull. It unites the squamous portion of the temporal bone with the parietal bone. It's a more overlapping, scale-like suture. Squamous means scale-like. Pterion. There's a clinically important region called the pterion. This isn't a single suture, but an H-shaped area where 4 bones meet: the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, squamous part, and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. The pterion is significant because it's the weakest part of the skull. Located just deep to the pterion, on the inside of the skull, is a major branch of an artery, the middle meningeal artery, that supplies the coverings of the brain. A blow to this area can fracture these thin bones and damage the artery, leading to a hematoma, a collection of blood, that can put pressure on the brain. This is a medical emergency. The pterion is roughly located about 2 finger widths above your zygomatic arch and a thumb's width behind the back of your eye socket. So, sutures like the coronal, sagittal, lambdoid, and squamous lock the skull bones together. The pterion is a notable weak point due to the underlying artery. Part 6. Facial bones of the skull. Now, let's move to the facial bones. These bones form the upper and lower jaws, the nose, the nasal cavity, the nasal septum, and the orbits. There are 14 facial bones. 6 are paired, meaning there's a right and a left. 2 are unpaired, single bones. The paired facial bones are maxillary bones, maxillae, palatine bones, zygomatic bones, nasal bones, lacrimal bones, inferior, nasal conchae. The unpaired facial bones are vomer bone, mandible. Let's briefly describe each. Maxillary bones, maxillae. These two bones, right and left maxilla, fuse together at the midline to form the upper jaw. They also contribute to much of the hard palate, the bony roof of your mouth. The medial floor of the orbit, eye socket. The lateral base of the nose. The curved lower margin of the maxilla that holds the upper teeth is called the alveolar process of the maxilla. Each tooth sits in a deep socket called an alveolus. Remember the infraorbital foramen we talked about in the anterior view? That's on the anterior surface of the maxilla, just below the orbit. On the inferior side, if you were looking up into the roof of the mouth, the palatine process of each maxillary bone joins at the midline to form the anterior 3/4 of the hard palate. Palatine bones. These are a pair of irregularly shaped bones. Their most significant part is the horizontal plate. The horizontal plates of the right and left palatine bones join at the midline to form the posterior 1/4 of the hard palate. So the hard palate is mostly maxilla in the front and palatine bones at the back. They also contribute small areas to the lateral walls of the nasal cavity and the medial wall of each orbit. A quick note on cleft lip and cleft palate. During embryonic development, the maxilla bones and palatine bones must fuse properly at the midline. If this fusion fails, it can result in conditions like cleft lip, a gap in the upper lip, or cleft palate, a gap in the hard palate. Cleft palate can make it difficult for infants to feed because it creates an opening between the oral and nasal cavities. Zygomatic bones. These are your cheekbones. Each paired zygomatic bone forms much of the lateral wall of the orbit and the lateral inferior margins of the anterior opening of the orbit. Remember the temporal process of the zygomatic bone? It projects posteriorly to form the anterior part of the zygomatic arch. Nasal bones. 2 small bones that join, articulate, with each other to form the bony bridge of your nose. These are the bones that get broken if you break your nose. They also support the cartilages that form the lateral walls of your nose. Lacrimal bones. These are small rectangular bones, one in each eye socket. Each lacrimal bone forms a part of the anterior medial wall of the orbit. Lacrimal refers to tears. The anterior part of the lacrimal bone has a shallow depression called the lacrimal fossa, which leads into the nasolacrimal canal. Lacrimal fluid, tears, drains from the corner of your eye into this canal, which then opens into the nasal cavity. This is why your nose runs when you cry a lot. Inferior nasal conchae. We've met these before. Each is a curved bony plate that projects into the nasal cavity from the lower lateral wall. They are independent bones, unlike the superior and middle conchae, which are part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior nasal conchae are the largest of the 3. Vomer bone. This is an unpaired triangular-shaped bone. It forms the posterior inferior part of the nasal septum, the wall dividing your nasal cavity. You can see it best looking from behind into the posterior openings of the nasal cavity. Mandible. This is the lower jaw and, as we know, the only movable bone of the skull. It's a single U-shaped bone in adults. It fuses from 2 halves in the first year of life. Each side of the mandible has a horizontal body, which holds the lower teeth in its alveolar process. A vertically oriented ramus. Ramus means branch. The angle of the mandible is where the body and ramus meet on the outside margin. The ramus has 2 important upward projections. 1. The coronoid process, a flattened anterior projection. It's an attachment site for a major biting muscle. 2. The condylar process, the posterior projection topped by an oval-shaped condyle. This condyle articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint, TMJ. Between these two processes is a broad U-shaped curve called the mandibular notch. Other landmarks on the mandible: mental protuberance, the forward projection from the inferior margin of the anterior mandible that forms your chin. Mental refers to chin. Mental foramen, an opening on each side of the anterior lateral mandible. A sensory nerve for the chin exits here. Mandibular foramen, an opening on the medial, inner side of the ramus. This is where the nerve and blood vessels that supply the lower teeth enter a tunnel running through the mandibular body. Dentists aim for this area when numbing your lower teeth. Lingula, a small flap of bone next to the mandibular foramen. A ligament supporting the mandible attaches here. Lingula means little tongue. So the 14 facial bones provide the structure for our face, jaws, and parts of our sensory organs. Part 7. The orbit. Let's revisit the orbit, the bony socket for the eyeball. Each orbit is cone-shaped, narrow at the back and wide at the front. The bony margins are thickened for protection. The walls of each orbit are formed by contributions from 7 skull bones. Let's list them. 1. Frontal bone forms the roof. 2. Zygomatic bone forms the lateral wall and lateral floor. 3. Maxillary bone primarily forms the medial floor. 4. Palatine bone makes a small contribution to the medial floor. 5. Ethmoid bone forms much of the medial wall. 6. Lacrimal bone, also part of the medial wall, anteriorly. 7. Sphenoid bone forms the posterior part of the orbit. At the very back, apex of the orbit, there are 2 important openings connecting to the cranial cavity. Optic canal allows the optic nerve to pass from the retina of the eye to the brain. Superior orbital fissure, a larger irregular opening lateral to the optic canal. It allows passage for arteries supplying the eyeball, sensory nerves, and nerves that control eye movements. To remember the 7 bones, you could try a mnemonic, though it might be a bit forced. How about, for zoos, many people enjoy looking sideways. Frontal, zygomatic, maxilla, palatine, ethmoid, lacrimal, sphenoid. Part 8. The nasal septum and nasal conchae. A recap. We've touched on these, but let's consolidate. The nasal septum, dividing the nasal cavity, has bony and cartilaginous parts. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone forms the upper part. Vomer bone forms the lower and posterior parts. Septal cartilage, not present in a dry skull, forms the anterior part, filling the gap between the ethmoid and vomer and extending into the fleshy part of your nose. The nasal conchae are curved bony plates projecting from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. They swirl, warm, and humidify incoming air. Superior nasal concha, part of the ethmoid bone, smallest, most superior. Middle nasal concha, part of the ethmoid bone. Inferior nasal concha, an independent bone, largest, most inferior. Part 9. Cranial fossae, the brain's terraces. Let's go back inside the skull to the floor of the cranial cavity, which is divided into those 3 terraces, or cranial fossae. They increase in depth from front to back. Anterior cranial fossa, location, most anterior and shallowest. It overlies the orbits. Contents, contains the frontal lobes of the brain. Boundaries, bounded anteriorly by the frontal bone. The posterior boundary is a prominent ledge formed by the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. Key features in its floor. At the midline, you find parts of the ethmoid bone, the upward projecting crista galli, and on either side of it, the cribriform plates with their olfactory foramina for the smell nerves. Middle cranial fossa. Location, deeper and posterior to the anterior fossa. It has a sort of butterfly shape, narrow at the midline and broad laterally. Contents, contains the temporal lobes of the brain. Boundaries, extends from the lesser wings of the sphenoid, anteriorly, to the petrous ridges of the temporal bones, posteriorly. The petrous ridges are those dense diagonal parts of the temporal bones, midline feature, divided at the midline by the upward prominence of the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, which houses the pituitary gland. Openings. This fossa has several important openings we've encountered. Optic canal, anterolateral corner of the sella turcica, for the optic nerve. Superior orbital fissure, lateral to the optic canal, into the posterior orbit, for nerves and vessels to the eye. Foramen rotundum, rounded opening in the floor, for a major sensory nerve to cheek, nose, upper teeth. Foramen ovale, oval-shaped opening posterior to rotundum, for a major sensory nerve to lateral head, cheek, chin, lower teeth. Foramen spinosum, small opening, posterior lateral to oval, for an artery supplying brain coverings. Carotid canal. The internal opening of this canal is near the posterior lateral base of the sella turcica, for the carotid artery to the brain. Foramen lacerum, an irregular opening at the base of the skull, just inferior to where the carotid canal exits internally. In a living person, this foramen is filled with cartilage, so nothing truly passes through it in the same way as other foramina. Lacerum means ragged or torn, indicating its irregular edges in a dry skull. Posterior cranial fossa. Location. Most posterior and deepest part of the cranial cavity. Contents. Contains the cerebellum, part of the brain responsible for coordination and balance. Boundaries. Bounded anteriorly by the petrous ridges of the temporal bones. The occipital bone forms its floor and posterior wall. Midline feature. Divided at the midline by the very large foramen magnum, for the spinal cord. Openings. Internal acoustic meatus, located on the medial wall of the petrous ridge for nerves of hearing, balance, and facial muscles. Hypoglossal canal, at the anterior lateral margin of the foramen magnum, for a nerve to the tongue muscles. Jugular foramen, a large, irregularly shaped opening located immediately inferior to the internal acoustic meatus. Several cranial nerves exit the skull here, and it's also the main exit point for venous blood draining from the brain. These fossae provide a contoured bed for the brain, with specific openings allowing vital communication between the brain and the rest of the body. Part 10. Paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are hollow, air-filled spaces located within certain bones of the skull. Paranasal means next to the nasal cavity, and all these sinuses connect to the nasal cavity. They are lined with the same kind of mucous membrane found in the nose. What do? They reduce the overall bone mass of the skull, making it lighter. 2. They add resonance to your voice. You might notice your voice sounds different when you have a cold and your sinuses are congested. This is because the swelling and mucus can block the narrow passageways, changing the resonance and sometimes causing pressure and pain. The sinuses are named for the skull bones in which they are located. Frontal sinus, located in the frontal bone, just above your eyebrows, can be 1 or 2 spaces. Most anterior, maxillary sinus. These are the largest sinuses, paired, located within the maxillary bones below the orbits. They are commonly involved in sinus infections. Because their drainage opening into the nasal cavity is high on their medial wall, they can be difficult to drain. Sphenoid sinus, a single midline sinus located within the body of the sphenoid bone, just anterior and inferior to the sella turcica. This makes it the most posterior of the paranasal sinuses. Ethmoid air cells. These are not one large cavity, but multiple small interconnected spaces within the lateral parts of the ethmoid bone, between the upper nasal cavity and the medial wall of the orbit. So frontal, maxillary, sphenoid, and ethmoid bones house these air-filled sinuses. Part 11. The hyoid bone. Finally, let's talk about a unique bone often discussed with the skull, though it's not technically part of it, the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is an independent bone. This means it does not articulate, form a joint, with any other bone in the body. It's a small U-shaped bone located in the upper neck, near the level of your inferior mandible, lower jaw, with the tips of the U pointing backward. What does it do if it doesn't connect to other bones? It serves as a movable base for the tongue, which sits above it. It's attached to the larynx, voice box, below, and the pharynx, throat posteriorly. It's held in position by a series of small muscles that attach to it from above and below. These muscles move the hyoid up, down, or forward back. Movements of the hyoid are coordinated with movements of the tongue, larynx, and pharynx during important functions like swallowing and speaking. So, the hyoid bone is a free-floating, U-shaped bone in the neck crucial for tongue movement, swallowing, and speech. Conclusion. We've covered a lot of ground in this audio lesson on the skull. We've seen that the skull is a complex structure made of 22 bones, plus the hyoid nearby. It's divided into the brain case, which protects the brain within the cranial cavity and its foci, and the facial bones, which form our facial features, jaws, orbits, and nasal passages. We've identified many individual bones like the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid bones of the brain case, and the maxilla, mandible, zygomatic, nasal, lacrimal, palatine, vomer, and inferior nasal conchas of the face. We've also explored sutures that bind them, foramina that allow passage for nerves and vessels, and specialized structures like the paranasal sinuses. The skull's architecture is a testament to its dual roles, providing strong protection for our most vital organ, the brain, while also forming the framework for our senses and the beginning of our digestive and respiratory tracts. Thank you for listening. I hope this audio journey through the skull has been informative and helps you appreciate the intricate design of this essential part of our anatomy. You might want to listen again to certain sections to reinforce your understanding, as anatomy often benefits from repetition.